The sound of my daughter's voice cut through the morning silence like a blade. "Mom, you're embarrassing yourself," Carmen said, not even looking up from her phone as she spoke. "Nobody wants to hear about your little hobby investments anymore." I was standing in my kitchen, coffee mug trembling slightly in my hands, staring at the laptop screen that showed numbers I could barely believe myself. 7 figures, 7 actual figures in my retirement account, and my own family thought I was playing pretend with Monopoly money. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. It was 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in November, and I had just watched my portfolio cross a milestone I'd been working toward for 37 years. 37 years of quiet discipline, careful research, and investments that everyone around me called cute or ambitious for someone like you. The irony wasn't lost on me that the daughter who just called my life's work embarrassing was the same one who'd asked me for grocery money just last week. But this story doesn't start with victory. It starts with shame, humiliation, and the suffocating feeling of being invisible in your own family. Because before I became the woman staring at a screen that proved everyone wrong, I was Hilda Martinez, 67 years old, recently retired from 35 years as a public school administrative assistant, and according to my 3 adult children, completely useless. My retirement party was supposed to be a celebration. Instead, it felt like a funeral where I was somehow both the deceased and the mourner. The school district had rented a corner of the local community center, the same beige-walled room where they held budget meetings and PTA fundraiser. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in that particular shade of institutional yellow that makes everyone look slightly ill. I wore my best dress, the navy blue one with tiny white flowers that I'd bought for my grandson's graduation 3 years earlier. It still fit well, and I'd even splurged on getting my graying hair styled at the salon downtown. At 67, I thought I looked pretty good. I thought I deserved to feel proud. The cake was sheet cake from the grocery store. "Congratulations, Hilda," written in pink frosting that had started to slide in the heat. My coworkers, teachers and administrators I'd supported for decades, gave polite speeches about my reliability and dedication. They presented me with a plaque and a gift card to Target. Everyone clapped appropriately. My family arrived late. Carmen, my oldest at 42, rushed in during the principal's speech, her heels clicking loudly against the linoleum floor. She worked in marketing for a pharmaceutical company and never let anyone forget it. Behind her came Roberto, my middle child at 39, still wearing his mechanic's uniform with oil stains on the chest. My youngest, Sophia, 26 and fresh out of graduate school with more debt than common sense, slipped in behind them both, already scrolling through her phone. They found seats in the back, and I tried not to notice how Carmen checked her watch 3 times during the 20-minute ceremony. When it was over, and people began filtering around the refreshment table, my children approached me with the kind of forced smiles you'd give a distant relative at a funeral. "So, what's the plan now, Ma?" Roberto asked, picking icing off a piece of cake with his finger. "You gonna take up knitting? Join one of those senior centers where they play bingo all day?" I forced a laugh. "Actually, I'm looking forward to having more time to focus on my investment. I've been tracking some interesting opportunities in the renewable energy sector, and with the new tax advantages for retirees." "Oh God, here we go again," Sophia interrupted, not even pretending to listen. "Mom, seriously, you need to find a hobby that doesn't involve pretending you're some kind of Wall Street expert." Carmen nodded in agreement. "Maybe you could volunteer somewhere. Do something useful with your time instead of playing around on those investment websites." Playing around. That's what they called the 37 years I'd spent carefully building my financial future. Playing around. The conversation moved on quickly, as it always did when I tried to discuss my investment. Carmen talked about her latest promotion, Roberto complained about his boss, and Sophia showed us photos from her recent vacation to Europe, funded entirely by credit cards she couldn't afford. They stayed for exactly 45 minutes, long enough to appear respectful, short enough to avoid any real conversation. As I drove home that evening, still wearing my navy dress with the tiny white flowers, I realized something that should have been obvious years earlier. My own children had no idea who I really was. To them, I was just Mom, the woman who'd raised them as a single parent after their father left when Sophia was barely walking. I was the one who'd worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table, who'd sewn Halloween costumes by hand, and saved for months to buy school supplies each fall. I was reliable, predictable, and apparently completely incapable of understanding anything more complicated than a savings account. What they didn't know, what I'd never found the right moment to explain, was that I'd been investing since Sophia was in diaper. Not big amounts, never money we needed for essentials, but every spare $20, every tax refund, every birthday check from my mother had gone into carefully researched stocks, bonds, and mutual funds. I'd started with a small brokerage account and a library full of investment books. I'd taught myself to read financial statements, to understand market trends, to spot undervalued companies before they became household names. I'd bought Apple stock in 1997, when my children were more interested in their Game Boys than computer. I'd invested in Amazon when it was still just a bookstore, and Tesla when everyone said electric cars would never catch on. I'd weathered the dot-com crash, the 2008 financial crisis, and the COVID market volatility by sticking to my research and never panic selling. But to my family, I was just Hilda Martinez, retired administrative assistant, puttering around with hobby investments, because I didn't have anything better to do. The house felt different when I unlocked the front door that night. It was the same modest 3-bedroom ranch I'd bought 22 years earlier, the same beige carpeting and white walls, the same secondhand furniture I'd collected over the years, but something fundamental had shifted. For the first time in 35 years, I didn't have to set an alarm for the morning. I didn't have to lay out my work clothes or pack a lunch. I was officially retired. I sat at my kitchen table and opened my laptop, the same reliable Dell I'd been using for 8 years. The investment portfolio dashboard loaded slowly, but when it did, I allowed myself a small smile. Even with the recent market volatility, I was looking at numbers that most people my age could only dream of, numbers that would shock my children if they ever bothered to look, but they never asked. In their minds, I was financially illiterate, someone who needed their guidance and protection. Carmen had tried multiple times to convince me to let her help manage my money, suggesting I move everything into a simple savings account where it would be safe. Roberto thought I should buy lottery tickets instead of wasting money on the stock market. Sophia had once laughed out loud when I mentioned reading the Wall Street Journal. The irony was suffocating. Here I was, a woman who'd built a retirement portfolio that most financial advisors would be proud of, and my own family treated me like I didn't understand the difference between a checking and savings account. That night, I made myself a simple dinner and ate it alone at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd helped my children with homework for years, where I'd sat every morning before work reviewing my investment research. The silence felt different now, not empty, exactly, but expectant. Like the house itself was waiting to see what I would do with all this newfound time. I'd always imagined retirement as a beginning, not an ending, a chance to travel, maybe take some classes, certainly to spend more time managing my investments with the kind of attention they deserve. I'd dreamed of proving to my children that their mother was more than just the woman who'd kept their lives organized and their bellies full. But sitting there in my quiet kitchen, laptop glowing in the dim light, I realized that proving myself to them might be harder than I'd thought. They'd spent decades seeing me as one thing, and people rarely change their minds easily, especially about their parents. The next morning started what would become my new routine. No alarm clock, but I still woke up at 5:30 a.m., 35 years of habit, being stronger than retirement. I made coffee, opened my laptop, and spent the first 2 hours of each day immersed in market research. I read earnings reports, analyzed technical charts, and tracked the performance of companies I'd been watching for years. It was during one of these quiet morning sessions, about 2 weeks after my retirement party, that Carmen called. "Mom, I've been thinking," she said, her voice carrying that tone she used when she was about to manage my life for me. "Now that you have all this free time, maybe you should consider moving somewhere smaller. You don't need all that space and you could probably save money on utility." I looked around my kitchen, at the bulletin board covered with investment articles I'd printed out, at the filing cabinet where I kept 37 years of financial records meticulously organized. "I'm comfortable here, Carmen, and money isn't really an issue." I know you think that. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. But Mom, you're on a fixed income now. You can't keep spending money like you did when you were working. Fixed income. As if my retirement consisted of nothing but Social Security and whatever pittance the school district had managed to contribute to my fortune over the years. As if I hadn't spent decades building something they couldn't even imagine. I appreciate your concern, I said carefully, but I've been planning for this retirement for a very long time. I'm financially secure. Carmen laughed. Not unkindly, but with the patronizing tone of an adult humoring a child. Mom, we all know you've been playing around with those investment accounts, but that's not real money. You need to be practical now. Playing around. There it was again. After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen and did something I'd never done before. I printed out my complete portfolio statement, all 47 pages of it. I spread the papers across my dining room table and looked at the numbers in black and white. Stocks, bonds, mutual funds, REITs, international investments, dividend-paying companies I'd held for over a decade. The total value printed in bold at the bottom of the last page, $1,247.30. More money than my children would probably see in their lifetimes, earned through careful research, patient investing, and the kind of financial discipline they'd never bothered to understand. I gathered up the papers and put them back in their folder. Not because I was ashamed of what I'd accomplished, but because I was beginning to understand that my family's view of me was so entrenched that even evidence might not change their minds. The calls started coming regularly after. Roberto would stop by unannounced, usually when he needed something, and always with suggestions about how I should be living my life. He thought I should sell my car and take the bus everywhere. He recommended I start shopping at discount grocery stores and using coupons religiously. He even suggested I look into senior housing before the good spots fill up. Sophia was worse. She'd arrive with printouts of senior citizen activities, community center schedules, and brochures for retirement community. She'd found a book club that met at the library and a walking group that gathered in the park every Tuesday morning. She spoke to me like I was newly widowed and struggling to find purpose, not a woman who'd been successfully managing her own life for decades. The important thing, she told me one afternoon, sitting in my living room with a stack of pamphlets spread across my coffee table, is that you stay active and engaged. Depression is really common among new retirees, especially women living alone. I looked at her, this young woman who'd never held a job for more than 2 years, who still called me when she couldn't figure out how to file her taxes, who'd asked me for financial help just 3 months earlier when her car needed repairs. She was trying to manage my emotional well-being. I'm not depressed, Sophia. I'm actually quite happy to have more time to focus on things I enjoy. Like what? Those investment websites. The way she said it, with air quotes around the word investment, made my stomach clench. Yes, like my investments, and maybe some traveling. I've been thinking about taking a cruise, or maybe visiting those wine regions in California I've been reading about. Sophia and Roberto exchanged a look that I'd seen before, the kind of glance that said, Mom's being unrealistic again. Those things are expensive, Maud, Roberto said gently. Maybe start with something local. There's that new senior center downtown. They have activities every day. I excused myself to make coffee, standing in my kitchen with my hands pressed flat against the counter, trying to understand how I'd become a stranger in my own family. These were my children, people I'd sacrificed for, worried about, loved unconditionally for decades. But somewhere along the way, they'd decided who I was supposed to be, and that person wasn't someone capable of financial independence or worldly ambition. That evening, after they'd left with promises to check on me again soon, I sat down with my laptop and did something I'd been considering for weeks. I researched luxury cruises, not the budget-friendly ones Sophia would probably approve of, but the kind with balcony suites, and wine tastings, and shore excursions to places I'd only read about. I found a Mediterranean cruise, departing from Barcelona in 3 months, 14 days of visiting ports I'd dreamed about since I was young. The cost was $8,400 for a suite with a private balcony. I could afford it without touching my principal investments, just from the dividends I'd earned over the past 6 months. I could afford it twice over and not impact my long-term financial security at all. But as I stared at the booking page, I realized that the money wasn't the issue. The issue was that I'd somehow become afraid to live my own life, because my family had convinced me I didn't understand how to do it properly. I closed the laptop without booking the cruise. The pattern continued for months, weekly phone calls asking if I was managing okay, financial visits where my children would scan my house for signs that I was spending money unwisely, comments about how I should be more careful with my resources now that I was retired. Each conversation reinforced their belief that I was financially naive and potentially headed for trouble. The breaking point came on a Thursday afternoon in March. Carmen had stopped by unexpectedly, letting herself in with the spare key I'd given her years earlier for emergency. I was in my home office, the spare bedroom I'd converted into a workspace where I could spread out my research and monitor my investments on a larger computer screen I'd recently purchased. "Mom?" she called from the front door. "Where are you?" "In the office," I called back, not thinking about how that might sound. She appeared in the doorway, taking in the dual monitors, the filing cabinets, the bulletin board covered with financial charts and company research. Her expression shifted from confusion to something that looked almost like alarm. "What is all this?" she asked, stepping into the room, like she was entering a crime scene. "This is where I manage my investments," I said, turning in my chair to face her. "I converted this room, after I retired, so I'd have a proper workspace." Carmen walked slowly around the room, looking at the Wall Street Journal subscription certificates on the wall, the investment books lining 2 shelves, the sophisticated portfolio tracking software running on my screen. "Mom," she said finally, her voice heavy with the kind of concern you'd use for someone who'd joined a cult, "this looks obsessive. This isn't normal for someone your age, someone my age." As if 67 meant I should be content with crossword puzzles and afternoon television. "Carmen, I've been investing for almost 4 decades. This isn't a new hobby. This is something I've been passionate about and successful with for most of your life." She sat down in the extra chair I kept for when I had conference calls with my financial advisor, a man who'd been managing my account for 12 years, and treated me with the respect my own family couldn't manage. "Successful?" Carmen's voice was gentle but patronizing. "Mom, I know you think you're making money, but these online investment things are mostly scams. You could lose everything." I stared at her, this daughter I'd raised and educated, who worked in corporate marketing and considered herself financially sophisticated, telling me that the stock market was a scam. "Carmen," I said slowly, "do you know how much money I have invested?" She shrugged. "I assume it's whatever you managed to save from your job. Maybe a few $1,000s? That's why I worry about you risking it on these websites. A few $1,000s. 37 years of disciplined investing, and my daughter assumed I'd managed to scrape together enough money for a used car." That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I called my financial advisor, Gregory Patterson, a man who'd never once questioned my intelligence or capability, who'd watched my portfolio grow from 6 figures to 7, who'd helped me navigate tax strategies and estate planning with the kind of respect I deserve. "Gregory," I said when he answered his phone, "I need to make some changes to my account, some significant changes." "Of course, Mrs. Martinez. What did you have in mind?" "I want to restructure my portfolio for maximum liquidity. I want to be able to access large amounts of cash quickly if I need to." There was a pause. Gregory had been my advisor long enough to know that I never made impulsive decisions about money. "May I ask what's prompting this change in strategy?" I looked around my home office, at all the evidence of a financial expertise my own family refused to acknowledge. "I think it's time my family learned who I really am," I said, "and I think that's going to require a demonstration they can't ignore." Gregory chuckled, a sound that held both amusement and anticipation. "Mrs. Martinez, in 12 years of working together, you've never ceased to surprise me. Whatever you're planning, I have a feeling it's going to be interesting." After we hung up, I sat in my office until well past midnight, making plans that would either finally earn my family's respect or destroy my relationships with them entirely. But I was tired of being invisible, tired of being underestimated, tired of having my life's work dismissed as the hobby of a lonely old woman. My children thought I was useless now that I was retired. They thought I was financially naive and potentially vulnerable to scam. They thought I needed their guidance and protection. They were about to learn exactly how wrong they were. The portfolio restructuring took 3 weeks to complete. Gregory worked with his team to liquidate certain positions and consolidate others, creating a financial foundation that would allow me to access substantial amounts of cash within 24 hours, if needed. It wasn't a complete overhaul, just a strategic repositioning that maintained my long-term growth potential while giving me the flexibility to make some dramatic moves. During those 3 weeks, my family continued their campaign of concern and condescension. Roberto brought me grocery store coupons and a calculator, suggesting I track my monthly expenses more carefully. Sophia signed me up for a financial literacy class at the community college without asking. Carmen researched reverse mortgages and left the information on my kitchen counter. Each gesture, meant with love but rooted in the assumption that I was incapable of managing my own affairs, strengthened my resolve. They wanted to treat me like a child who couldn't be trusted with money, fine. But children who misbehave eventually face consequences, and my children were about to discover that their mother was not the helpless retiree they'd imagined. The plan I'd formulated was simple in concept but devastating in execution. My children believed I was poor, so I would show them wealth. They believed I was financially illiterate, so I would demonstrate expertise they couldn't argue with. They believed I needed their help, so I would prove that the opposite was true. But first, I needed to set the stage properly, and that meant making some purchases that would force them to confront the reality they'd been ignoring for years. The morning I decided to buy the Mercedes, I woke up to 17 missed calls from Sophia. Apparently, Miss Tren from next door had mentioned seeing me looking at luxury car brochures online, and Sophia had worked herself into a panic overnight, thinking I was about to blow my life savings on something completely impractical. I was sitting in my kitchen, still in my bathrobe, when she burst through my front door using her emergency key for the 3rd time that month. "Mom, please tell me you're not seriously considering buying an expensive car," she said, not even bothering with a greeting. Her hair was still damp from the shower, and she was wearing scrubs from the veterinary clinic where she worked part-time between graduate school applications. "Mrs. Chen said she saw you with dealership websites open on your computer." I took a slow sip of my coffee and looked at my youngest daughter, this 26-year-old woman who had never owned a car that wasn't financed at 18% interest, lecturing me about financial responsibility. "Good morning to you too, Sophia. And yes, I am considering a new car. This Honda is 12 years old and starting to have problems, but Mom, you don't need a Mercedes. There are perfectly good used cars that would last you the rest of your..." She stopped herself, but the implication hung in the air like smoke. "The rest of your life." As if at 67 I was expected to buy my final vehicle and drive it to my grave. "The rest of my what, Sophia?" Her face flushed. "I just meant, something more practical, more budget-friendly." I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at my modest neighborhood of ranch homes and small lawns. Most of my neighbors were retirees like me, people who'd worked hard their whole lives, and were now living carefully on fixed income. I understood why Sophia would assume I was in the same situation. What she didn't understand was that while she'd been accumulating student debt and credit card balances, I'd been quietly building wealth that could buy a dozen Mercedes without impacting my financial security. "Sophia, do you know how much money I make in dividends each month?" She frowned, the way she always did when I mentioned anything investment-related. "Mom, dividend checks are like $20 or $30. They're not real income." $20 or $30. Last month, my dividend income had been $11,147. The month before that, $10,203. My quarterly distributions from my real estate investment trusts alone exceeded what Sophia made in a month at the vet clinic. "You're right," I said, turning back to face her. "I shouldn't make any major purchases without thinking them through carefully." Relief flooded her face. "Exactly. Maybe we could go look at some certified pre-owned cars this weekend, something reliable but affordable." After she left, I sat in my home office and pulled up the Mercedes website again. I'd been looking at the E-Class sedan, a beautiful car in metallic silver with leather seats and the kind of smooth, quiet ride I'd dreamed about during 35 years of commuting in economy car. The price was $67,000,
fully loaded with every option I wanted. I could afford it, I could afford 10 of them, but buying one would require explaining to my family how I could afford it, and I wasn't ready for that conversation yet, because the truth was more complicated than just having money. The truth was that I'd been living a double life for decades, pretending to struggle financially while secretly building wealth that would shock them. The deception hadn't started intentional. When the children were young and money was genuinely tight, I'd developed habits of frugality that had served me well. I shopped sales, used coupons, bought generic brands, and never spent money frivolous. But even then, even when Roberto needed new shoes and Carmen wanted dance lessons we couldn't afford, I'd managed to put away $20 or $30 here and there. I'd started with a simple savings account, but I'd quickly realized that inflation was eating away at my money faster than the bank was paying interest. So I'd checked out investment books from the library where I worked, studying them during my lunch breaks, and after the children went to bed. I'd learned about compound interest and dollar cost averaging, about the difference between growth stocks and value stocks, about how to read a company's financial statements. My first stock purchase had been 10 shares of Coca-Cola in 1984, bought with money I'd saved from my tax refund. The children were 8, 5 and 2 then, and I'd told myself I was buying their future college educations, but somewhere between watching that first investment grow and adding more stocks to my portfolio, I'd discovered something I hadn't expected. I was good at this. I had an intuitive understanding of business cycles, an ability to spot trends before they became obvious, and most importantly, the patience to hold good investments through market volatility. While my neighbors panic sold during market crashes, I'd used those opportunities to buy more shares at discounted prices. While others chased hot tips and day trading schemes, I'd focused on solid companies with strong fundamentals and reliable dividend growth. By the time Carmen graduated high school, my portfolio was worth 6 figures. By the time Sophia finished college, it had crossed into 7 figures. And through it all, I'd maintained the same modest lifestyle, the same careful spending habits, the same appearance of financial ordinariness that my family had come to expect. The irony was that their assumptions about my financial limitations had actually helped me build wealth. Because they expected me to struggle, I'd never felt pressure to increase my spending as my net worth grew.
I'd never felt obligated to pick up expensive restaurant tabs or fund their adult lifestyle choices. Their belief that I couldn't afford luxury had allowed me to live below my means, even as those means expanded dramatically. But the secrecy was becoming harder to maintain. Every well-meaning suggestion about senior discounts and budget groceries felt like a personal insult. Every assumption that I needed financial help or guidance made me want to scream. I was tired of pretending to worry about money I didn't need to worry about, tired of accepting their charity when I could have been helping them. Instead, the breaking point came 3 days after Sophia's lecture about the Mercedes. Carmen called me on a Thursday evening, her voice tight with stress. "Mom, I hate to ask this, but could you loan me $2,000? Just until next month. I swear I'll pay you back." I was in my office, reviewing the quarterly report from one of my mutual fund holdings, when her call came in. On my computer screen was a portfolio that had gained $34,000 in value just that week, and my daughter was asking me for a loan that represented less than 0.1% of my net worth. "What do you need the money for?" I asked, though I was already pulling up my bank account to transfer the funds. "The air conditioning unit in our house died, and we need to replace it before the weather gets hot. Michael's been working overtime, but with Isabella's daycare costs and the mortgage, we just don't have that kind of cash lying around." Michael was Carmen's husband, a decent man who worked in pharmaceutical sales and made a good living. Isabella was their 4-year-old daughter, my only grandchild. They lived in a nice suburban house and drove newer cars, but like most Americans, they lived paycheck to paycheck despite earning well into 6 figures combined. "Of course I can help," I said, executing the transfer even as we spoke. "I'll move the money into your account tonight." "Thank you so much, Mom. I know this is probably a big stretch for you, but I didn't know who else to ask." A big stretch. $2,000 that I made in dividend income every 3 days was a big stretch for their mother. After we hung up, I sat in my office, feeling something I'd never experienced before: resentment toward my own children. Not because they asked for help when they needed it, but because they assumed that helping them would be difficult for me. Because they'd convinced themselves that I was barely scraping by, that every dollar was precious, that lending them money meant sacrificing my own security. The next morning, I called Gregory and asked him to schedule a meeting. Not a phone call, but an in-person meeting at his office downtown. The kind of meeting reserved for his wealthiest clients. I need to discuss some significant changes to my financial strategy, I told him. And I think it's time to start living like the wealthy woman I actually am. Gregory's office was on the 32nd floor of the city's most prestigious financial building, with floor-to-ceiling windows, overlooking the downtown skyline. I'd been there many times over the years, but I'd always felt slightly out of place in my conservative dresses and practical shoes, surrounded by the obvious wealth of his other clients. This time felt different. This time I wore a black suit I'd bought online but never had occasion to wear, paired with shoes that cost more than my usual monthly clothing budget. I'd had my hair styled professionally and even splurged on a manicure. When I walked into that office, I looked like what I was: a successful investor worth over $1 million. "Mrs. Martinez," Gregory said, standing to greet me with the kind of warm respect he showed all his major clients. "You look wonderful. Please, have a seat." His assistant brought us coffee in real porcelain cups, not the paper ones from the break room. Gregory opened a leather portfolio containing my account summaries, and we spent 20 minutes reviewing my holdings, discussing market conditions, and analyzing the performance of various sectors in my portfolio. It was a conversation between equals, between two people who understood finance and investing at a sophisticated level. Gregory never talked down to me, never explained basic concepts I already knew, never treated me like someone who'd stumbled into wealth by accident. He treated me like the knowledgeable investor I'd become. "Now," he said, settling back in his chair, "you mentioned wanting to discuss some changes to your strategy. What did you have in mind?" I took a deep breath. "Gregory, I've been living like a poor person for 40 years, even though I haven't been poor for at least 20 of them. I've been so focused on building wealth that I forgot to enjoy any of it. And my family has gotten so used to thinking of me as financially limited that they treat me like I don't understand money at all." He nodded thoughtfully. "That's not uncommon among our self-made clients. There's a security in maintaining the lifestyle that helped you build wealth in the first place, but there's also something to be said for enjoying the fruits of your labor." "I want to buy a Mercedes," I said. "And I want to take a luxury cruise. And I want to renovate my kitchen and maybe add a deck to the back of my house. I want to start living like someone who can afford those things, because I can." Gregory smiled. "Mrs. Martinez, your portfolio generates enough income to support all of those things without touching your principal. You could increase your lifestyle significantly and still see your wealth continue to grow." We spent the next hour discussing the practical aspects of what I was proposing: how to structure withdrawals for maximum tax efficiency, how to balance enjoying my money with preserving wealth for my heirs, how to protect myself from potential financial elder abuse if my family discovered the extent of my resources. That last point gave me pause: financial elder abuse. The idea that people might try to manipulate or control elderly family members who had money. I'd never thought of my children in those terms, but Gregory's concern made me realize that I needed to be careful about how I revealed my financial situation. "The key," he said, "is to maintain control while being strategic about disclosure. You don't need to tell them everything at once, and you certainly don't need to give them access to your accounts, but you can start living more openly without feeling like you need to justify every purchase." When I left his office that afternoon, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: excitement about spending money. Not the guilty pleasure of a small splurge, but the genuine anticipation of being able to afford things I'd wanted for decades. My first stop was the Mercedes dealership. The salesperson, a young man named David, who couldn't have been much older than Sophia, clearly sized me up as a tire kicker the moment I walked onto the lot. I was wearing my good suit, but I was still obviously a retiree looking at luxury cars, which probably meant I was either dreaming or shopping for my successful children. "Good afternoon," he said with professional politeness. Is there something specific you're interested in seeing today? I'd like to test drive the E-Class sedan, I said. The metallic silver one I saw on your website. He led me to the car, a beautiful machine that looked like it had been designed for someone much more sophisticated than the woman my family thought I was. The interior was leather and wood trim, with technology I'd only seen in car commercials. This is a beautiful car, David said, sliding into the passenger seat as I adjusted the mirrors and seat position. Are you shopping for yourself? Or is this for a family member? The assumption was clear. Surely this modest-looking grandmother wasn't planning to buy a $67,000 car for herself. It's for me, I said, pulling out of the parking lot onto the busy street. The car drove like a dream, smooth, quiet, responsive. The engine had power I'd never experienced, and the ride quality made my 12-year-old Honda feel like a covered wagon by comparison. This was what I could afford. This was what I deserved. It's a significant investment, David said as we returned to the dealership. Have you had a chance to speak with your financial advisor about the purchase? I almost laughed. If only he knew that my financial advisor had just finished encouraging me to spend more money, not less. I have, I said, and I'm ready to move forward if we can agree on terms. David's expression shifted slightly, from polite interest to actual attention. What kind of terms were you thinking about? I'd like to pay cash, I said. That got his full attention. Cash deals were rare in his business, especially from customers he'd initially dismissed as unlikely buyers. We spent the next 2 hours in his office, going through paperwork and discussing options. I added the premium package, the extended warranty and several accessories I'd never imagined owning. The final price was $72,050, and I paid for it with a cashier's check I'd obtained that morning. When David handed me the keys, he looked almost stunned. Mrs. Martinez, I have to say, this has been one of the most straightforward transactions I've ever handled. Most people need financing, trade-ins, extended negotiations. You knew exactly what you wanted and how to pay for it. I've been planning this purchase for a long time, I said, which was true in a way he couldn't possibly understand. Driving home in my new car, I felt something I hadn't experienced since I was young, the thrill of owning something beautiful just because I could. The car handled perfectly, the sound system was incredible, and every surface felt designed for someone who appreciated quality. But as I pulled into my modest driveway, next to my modest house in my modest neighborhood, I realized that buying the car was just the beginning. The real challenge would be explaining it to my family. I didn't have to wait long. Roberto showed up unannounced the next morning, ostensibly to check on me, but really to drop off his laundry because his washing machine was broken again. He knocked on my front door, then let himself in with his key before I could answer. "Ma, you here?" he called from the entryway. "In the kitchen," I called back, not moving from my seat at the table where I was reading the Wall Street Journal on my laptop. I heard his footsteps stop abruptly in the living room, then the front door open and close again. A moment later, he appeared in the kitchen doorway, his expression confused. "Ma, there's a brand new Mercedes in your driveway." I looked up from my laptop with what I hoped was casual interest. "Yes, I bought it yesterday." Roberto stared at me like I'd announced I was joining the circus. "You bought it?" "Yes, my old car was starting to have problems, so I decided to replace it." "But Ma," he sat down heavily in the chair across from me, his laundry bag forgotten. "That's a $70,000 car. Closer to 72 actually with the options I added." His face went pale. "Ma, please tell me you didn't sign some kind of crazy financing deal. Those car dealers will take advantage of seniors, especially women. They'll get you locked into payments you can't afford." I closed my laptop and gave him my full attention. "Roberto, I paid cash." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the refrigerator humming in the corner. Roberto opened his mouth, closed it, then opened it again. "Ma, where did you get $72,000 in cash?" "From my investment account." "Your investment account?" His voice was rising now, approaching panic. "Ma, those online investment things aren't real money. They're just numbers on a screen. You can't just withdraw that kind of cash from some website." I stood up and walked to my filing cabinet, Pulling out the folder that contained my most recent brokerage statements, I handed him the quarterly summary, 47 pages of detailed holdings and performance data. Roberto stared at the first page for a long time, his lips moving slightly as he read. Then he flipped to the second page, then the third. His expression shifted from confusion to disbelief, to something that looked almost like fear. "Ma," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, "this says you have over $1 million. Yes, it does. But how? When? You worked as a secretary your whole life, administrative assistant." I corrected silently, but I let it slide. "Roberto, I've been investing for 37 years. I started when you were 2 years old." He continued flipping through the pages, stopping occasionally to stare at specific numbers. "Apple stock, Amazon, Tesla. Ma, some of these holdings are worth hundreds of thousands of dollars." "Yes, they are. But you never said anything. You always acted like money was tight. You used coupons and shopped sales, and worried about every expense." I sat back down across from him. "I did those things because they were good habits that helped me save money to invest. And I never talked about my investments because no one in this family has ever taken them seriously." Roberto set the papers down on the table and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not the patronizing concern of an adult child worried about his aging mother, but the genuine surprise of someone realizing they'd completely misjudged a situation. "Ma, if you have this kind of money, why didn't you tell us? Why did you let us worry about you? Why did you accept our help when you could have been helping us?" The questions hung in the air between us, and I realized this was the conversation I'd been avoiding for years. Not just about money, but about trust, about family dynamics, about the assumptions we'd all made about each other. "Roberto," I said carefully, "when was the last time anyone in this family asked me about my financial situation instead of just assuming they knew what it was?" He thought about it, really thought about it, and I could see the realization dawning on his face. They'd never asked because they'd never considered that I might have anything interesting to tell them. "We just thought," he started, then stopped. "You thought I was financially illiterate. You thought I was playing around with pocket change. You thought I needed your protection and guidance." He nodded slowly, his face flushing with embarrassment. "Roberto, I've been managing my own money successfully for longer than you've been alive. I've weathered market crashes and economic recessions and come out ahead every time. I've built a portfolio that most professional investors would be proud of, and I've done it all while raising 3 children as a single mother and working full-time." The silence stretched between us, heavy with years of misunderstanding and underestimation. "I'm sorry, Ma," he said finally. I never thought. I know you didn't. None of you did. And that's been the hardest part of retirement. Not having enough money, but being treated like I don't understand money at all." Roberto picked up the investment statements again, flipping through them more slowly this time. "Ma, you could buy a house with what you made just last quarter. I know, I could buy several houses, and you've been sitting here listening to us lecture you about coupons and senior discount." "I have." He shook his head, a rueful smile beginning to form on his face. "No wonder you bought the Mercedes. You probably could have bought the whole dealership." "I probably could have," I agreed, "but I just wanted the one." We sat in silence for a few more minutes, Roberto continuing to page through my financial statements while I watched decades of assumptions crumble in real time. "Ma," he said finally, "Carmen and Sophia need to see this." I nodded. "Yes, they do. But Roberto, I need you to understand something. This isn't about the money. This is about respect. This is about my family seeing me as someone capable of making my own decisions, someone with valuable knowledge and experience, someone who doesn't need to be managed or protected." "I get it," he said, and for the first time in years, I believed he actually did. "And I need you to understand that just because I have money doesn't mean I'm going to start throwing it around carelessly. I've been disciplined about spending for 40 years, and that's not going to change overnight." "But you bought a $70,000 car." I smiled. "Yes, I did, because I could afford it, and because I wanted it, and because I'm tired of pretending I can't have nice things." Roberto laughed, actually laughed,
and the sound was lighter than any conversation we'd had in months. "Ma, I can't wait to see Sophia's face when she finds out you're rich." "I'm not rich," I corrected him. "I'm financially secure." "There's a difference." "What's the difference?" "Rich people buy things to show off their wealth. Financially secure people buy things because they can afford them, and they want them. Rich people worry about losing their money. Financially secure people have enough money that they don't need to worry." Roberto nodded thoughtfully. "And which one are you?" I looked around my modest kitchen, thinking about the years of careful planning and patient investing that had brought me to this moment. I'm a woman who worked hard, saved wisely, and invested well. I'm someone who can afford to buy a Mercedes, if I want one, or take a cruise, or help my children when they need it. But most importantly, I'm someone who's tired of being underestimated by her own family. Roberto reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Ma, I promise you, that's never going to happen again." It was a start, but I knew that changing 3 decades of family dynamics would take more than one conversation and one luxury car purchase. Carmen and Sophia would have their own reactions, their own adjustments to make, and I would have to figure out how to navigate this new reality, where my family finally understood who I really was. But sitting there in my kitchen, watching my middle child read through evidence of the life I'd built in secret, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: optimism about the future, and pride in the past. The Mercedes in my driveway was beautiful, but it was also a symbol that I was done hiding, done pretending, done accepting treatment that was beneath the woman I'd worked so hard to become. My children had thought retirement would make me useless. Instead, it had finally given me the freedom to show them exactly how useful I'd always been. Carmen arrived at my house on a Saturday morning like a woman on a mission, her face tight with the kind of controlled panic I'd seen when Isabella had swallowed a coin at age 2. She'd called Roberto the night before, demanding to know what he'd meant when he said Mom has some surprises for us, and apparently his vague responses had only amplified her anxiety. I was in my garden, wearing old jeans and a faded t-shirt, pulling weeds from around my tomato plants, when I heard her heels clicking rapidly across my driveway. The Mercedes was parked right where Roberto had seen it, gleaming silver in the morning sun, impossible to ignore. "Mother," Carmen called out, her voice carrying the particular tone she used when she was trying to maintain composure while everything inside her was screaming. "We need to talk." I straightened up slowly, brushing dirt off my knees, and turned to face my oldest child. Carmen was dressed for battle in a navy blazer and pressed slacks, her hair pulled back in the severe bun she wore to important meetings. She looked like she'd come to conduct an intervention. "Good morning, Carmen. Beautiful day, isn't?" She ignored my pleasantries entirely, gesturing toward the Mercedes with a wave that suggested she was trying not to point accusingly. "Roberto says you bought that car with cash." "I did, and he says you showed him some kind of investment portfolio." "I did that too." Carmen's jaw tightened. "Mother, I need to see those papers. All of them, right now." There was something in her tone that I didn't like, an assumption of authority that reminded me of the way she spoke to her subordinates at work, as if I were a confused elderly person who'd gotten myself into trouble and needed her to sort things out. "Why?" I asked simply. The question seemed to catch her off guard. Because I need to make sure you haven't been scammed. Because elderly people are targeted by financial predators all the time, and this whole situation sounds exactly like the kind of elaborate scheme they use to steal people's life savings. I set down my gardening trowel and gave Carmen my full attention. "You think I've been scammed? I think someone has convinced you that you have more money than you actually have, and then talked you into making a major purchase that's going to devastate your finances." The certainty in her voice was breathtaking. Carmen had examined no evidence, spoken to no financial professionals, and done no research whatsoever.
But she was absolutely convinced that her mother was the victim of fraud, because the alternative, that I actually knew what I was doing with money, was apparently inconceivable. "Carmen, sit down," I said, gesturing toward the patio chairs I'd placed near my vegetable garden. "Let's have this conversation properly." She remained standing, arms crossed. "I don't need to sit down. I need to see your real financial statements." not whatever fake documents these criminals have shown you. The documents Roberto saw yesterday were real. They came directly from my brokerage firm. Brokerage firm. Carmen's voice rose an octave. Mother, you don't have a brokerage firm. You have a savings account at the local bank and maybe a small retirement account from the school district. I have both of those things, I said calmly. I also have a substantial investment portfolio that I've been building for 37 years. Carmen stared at me like I'd claimed to be secretly married to a movie star. 37 years. Mother, you've never shown the slightest interest in investing. You don't even understand how credit cards work. That last comment hit me like a physical blow. I'd managed my family's finances as a single mother for over 2 decades, budgeted every dollar, never missed a payment, never carried debt I couldn't afford. I'd navigated tax law changes, mortgage refinancing, and college financial aid applications. But according to my daughter, I didn't understand credit cards. Carmen, I said, my voice sharper than I'd intended. I need you to go inside, wash your hands, and sit down at my kitchen table. Then I need you to actually look at the evidence, before you accuse me of being mentally incompetent. Something in my tone must have gotten through to her, because she finally stopped talking and followed me into the house. I led her to my home office, where my investment statements were still spread across the desk from my meeting with Roberto the day before. Carmen approached the papers like they might bite her, picking up the first page with obvious skepticism. I watched her expression change as she read, from dismissive certainty, to confusion, to something that looked almost like anger. This can't be right, she said, flipping to the second page. These numbers, Mother. This says you have Amazon stock worth over $200,000. I bought Amazon stock in 1997 when it was still primarily a bookstore. I've been adding to that position for 26 years. But Carmen sat down heavily in my desk chair, still clutching the papers. But you always said we couldn't afford things. You made me get a job in high school because we needed the money. You bought generic groceries and clipped coupons and worried about every expense. I did all of those things because they allowed me to save money for investing. Every dollar I didn't spend on unnecessary purchases was a dollar I could put toward building our financial security. Our financial security. Carmen's voice cracked slightly. Mother, if you had this kind of money, why didn't you pay for my college? Why did I have to take out student loans? Why did you let me graduate with $30,000 in debt, when you apparently had hundreds of thousands sitting in the stock market? The question hung in the air between us, and I realized we'd arrived at the heart of the matter. This wasn't really about whether I understood money or whether I'd been scammed. This was about choices I'd made, priorities I'd set, and the fact that my children were now learning they'd lived their entire lives based on false assumptions about our family's financial situation. Carmen, I said carefully, what would you have learned about money and work and responsibility if I'd simply paid for everything you wanted? I would have learned that my mother loved me enough to help me when she could afford to. The accusation in her voice was unmistakable, and it cut deeper than any concerns about my mental competence. Carmen wasn't just shocked about the money. She was angry about what she saw as decades of unnecessary sacrifice. Let me ask you something. If I'd paid for your college, your car, your wedding, and every other major expense in your life, would you have developed the work ethic that got you promoted to senior management? Would you have learned to budget and save and make smart financial decisions? Carmen's face flushed. That's not the point. That's exactly the point. You're successful because you had to be. You're financially responsible because you learned that money doesn't just appear when you need it. You appreciate what you have because you worked for it. But you let me struggle when you didn't have to. You watched me stress about student loan payments and credit card debt and rent money, and all that time you were sitting on enough money to solve all my problems. I picked up another folder from my filing cabinet and handed it to her. Open. Inside were copies of 3 $10,000 cashier's checks, each made out to different loan companies, each dated within the past 5 years. I paid off your student loans, I said quietly. All of them. You've been getting statements showing a zero balance because I've been making payments directly to the lenders. Carmen stared at the check copies, her mouth slightly open. I also paid off the credit card debt you accumulated during your divorce, and I've been contributing to Isabella's college fund every month for the past 4 years. But the payment stubs I get say the money is coming from automatic deductions from my checking account. Because I've been depositing enough money into your checking account each month to cover those payments. The deposits were small enough that they looked like payroll adjustments or bank errors. Carmen set the papers down on my desk and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. You've been secretly paying my debts. I've been helping my daughter without making her feel like she couldn't take care of herself. She paused, clearly struggling to process this information. That's incredibly manipulative. The words hit me like a slap. Manipulative. Yes, manipulative. You let me believe I was managing my own finances when you were actually controlling them behind the scenes. You let me stress about money that you were providing. You made decisions about my life without telling me. I sat down across from her, feeling suddenly exhausted. Carmen, I was trying to help you without hurting your pride or your independence. By lying to me for years, by letting you think you were succeeding on your own because you were. The work ethic, the career advancement, the smart decisions about your household budget. Those were all you. I just removed some of the financial stress that might have derailed your progress. Carmen stood up and began pacing around my small office, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. This is insane. My entire adult life has been based on a lie. Your entire adult life has been based on your own efforts and achievements. I just made sure student loan payments didn't prevent you from buying a house or credit card debt. Didn't keep you awake at night, without asking me, without telling me, without giving me the choice to accept your help or decline it. She was right, and I knew it. In my desire to help without damaging her self-reliance, I'd made decisions that affected her life without her knowledge or consent. I'd treated her like a child who couldn't handle the truth about our family's financial situation. You're right, I said finally. I should have told you. I should have been honest about what I could afford and what I was willing to do. Carmen stopped pacing and turned to face me. Why weren't you? Why all the secrecy? Because every time I tried to talk about my investments, you dismissed them as hobbies. Every time I mentioned my portfolio, you changed the subject. You made it clear that you didn't think I understood money, so I stopped trying to explain. I never. Carmen's voice trailed off as she apparently remembered the conversations I was referring to. Carmen, 3 months ago you told me I should put all my money in a savings account where it would be safe. Last year you suggested I might be getting scammed when I mentioned researching renewable energy stocks. 2 years ago you laughed when I said I was reading the Wall Street Journal. Her face grew paler with each example. I thought you were being taken advantage. I thought those investment websites were targeting seniors. I know what you thought, but you never asked me to explain my strategy, or to show you my research, or to prove that I knew what I was doing. You just assumed I didn't. Carmen sat back down looking deflated. So you decided to prove us all wrong by buying a luxury car and revealing that you're secretly wealthy. I decided to stop pretending to be someone I'm not. I decided to start living like the financially successful woman I actually am, instead of the struggling retiree you all expected me to be. We sat in silence for several minutes, Carmen occasionally picking up different pages from my investment statements, reading them more carefully now. I could see her mind working, recalculating everything she thought she knew about our family's history. Mother, she said finally, if you have this much money, why do you still live in this house? Why don't you travel or buy nice things or live somewhere more luxurious? Because I like this house, I like this neighborhood, I like the life I've built here. But you could afford so much more. Carmen, having money doesn't mean you have to spend it on things that don't matter to you. I could buy a mansion, but I don't want to maintain a mansion. I could buy expensive clothes, but I'm comfortable in the clothes I have. I could eat at fancy restaurants every night, but I enjoy cooking for myself. So what do you want to spend money on? I thought about it for a moment. Experiences, travel, maybe some home improvements that would make this place more comfortable. Nice gifts for my family. The security of knowing that I can handle any emergency that comes up. And the Mercedes? I smiled. I wanted a beautiful car that would be a pleasure to drive. I could afford it, So I bought it. Carmen nodded slowly, and I could see her starting to understand that wealth didn't have to change who you were fundamentally. It just gave you more options about how to live. There's something else I need to tell you, I said, pulling out another folder. About your father. Carmen's expression sharpened. Her father, my ex-husband, had left when she was 14. Roberto was 11, and Sophia was 4. He'd provided minimal child support for a few years, then disappeared entirely when he remarried and started a new family in another state. What about him? He's been trying to contact me for the past 2 years, ever since Sophia graduated college, and his child support obligations officially ended. I handed Carmen a stack of letters, emails and phone messages that I'd been saving in a file marked Miguel, do not answer. He wants money? Carmen asked, scanning the first letter. He wants a relationship. He says he's made mistakes and wants to reconnect with his children. He says he's changed. Carmen read through several more letters, her expression growing darker with each one. And you think this has something to do with your financial situation? I think he's been monitoring our family more closely than any of us realized. I think he knows about Roberto's job, about your promotion, about Sophia's graduate school plan, and I think he's smart enough to figure out that a single mother who raised 3 successful children probably managed her money better than he expected. You think he's after your portfolio? I think he's after whatever he can get. And Carmen, legally he has no claim to any of it. Everything I built after he left, but that doesn't mean he won't try to manipulate you children into helping him get access. Carmen set the letters down and looked at me with an expression that was part admiration, part frustration, and part something that might have been pride. You've been protecting us from him too. I've been protecting our family's financial security from someone who abandoned it 30 years ago, and now wants to benefit from the success he contributed nothing toward. Does Roberto know about this? Not yet. I wanted to tell you first, because you're the oldest, and because you're the one who's been most concerned about my financial decision-making. Carmen laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. Concerned about your financial decision-making. God, Mother, we've been such idiots. You've been loving children who wanted to protect your mother. There's nothing idiotic about that. There is when your mother turns out to be smarter about money than you are. We spent the next 2 hours going through my investment portfolio in detail. I explained my strategy, my research methods, my approach to risk management. I showed her the spreadsheets where I tracked dividend growth, the databases where I researched companies, the financial news sources I consulted every morning. Carmen asked intelligent questions. The kind of questions I'd been hoping someone in my family would ask for years. She wanted to understand how I'd identified undervalued stocks, how I'd managed to hold positions through market volatility, how I'd built such a diversified portfolio without professional management. You really are good at this, she said finally, looking up from a detailed analysis I'd written about one of my largest holdings. I've had almost 40 years to learn, and we've been treating you like you don't understand the difference between a checking and savings account. You've been treating me the way most adult children treat their aging parents, with love, but also with assumptions about declining competence. Carmen shook her head. I feel like I need to apologize for our entire relationship. You don't, but I do need you to understand that I'm not going to keep pretending to be financially helpless just because it makes you more comfortable. What does that mean? Practically, it means I'm going to start living like someone who can afford nice things. It means I'm not going to stress about spending money I can easily afford. It means I'm going to make financial decisions based on what I want, not what you think I should be able to afford. Carmen nodded. And it means we need to start treating you like the financially sophisticated adult you've always been. That would be nice. We were interrupted by the sound of the front door opening and Sophia's voice calling out, Mom? Roberto said you were having some kind of family meeting without me. Carmen and I looked at each other. Roberto had apparently decided that Sophia needed to be part of this conversation sooner rather than later. We're in the office, Carmen called back. Sophia appeared in the doorway looking suspicious and slightly offended. She was wearing yoga pants and an oversized sweater, her hair pulled back in a messy bun, and she had the particular expression she wore when she thought she was being excluded from something important. "What's going on?" she asked, looking around the room at the papers spread across every surface. Roberto was being all mysterious on the phone. "And Carmen, you look like someone died." Carmen gestured toward the desk. "Sophia, you need to sit down and look at these financial statements." "What financial statements?" "Mom's investment portfolio." Sophia remained standing, her arms crossed. "Is this about that car outside?" Because I already told her buying an expensive car was a bad idea. "Sophia," I said quietly, "sit down and look at the paper." Something in my tone must have penetrated because she finally moved toward the desk and picked up the first page of my quarterly summary. I watched her face go through the same progression of emotions I'd seen from Roberto and Carmen: confusion, disbelief, and then a kind of shocked recognition. "This says," Sophia's voice was barely above a whisper, "this says, you have over $1 million. "Yes, it does, but that's impossible. You worked as a secretary. You drove old cars and shopped at discount stores and worried about every expense." "Administrative assistant," I corrected automatically. "And yes, I did all those things because they allowed me to save money for investing." Sophia continued reading, flipping through pages with increasing agitation. "Tesla stock, Microsoft, Google." "Mom, some of these positions are worth more than most people make in 10 years. "I know, but you never said anything. You let us think you were struggling financially." Carmen cleared her throat. "Sophia, there's more. Show her the folder about Dad." I handed Sophia the letters from Miguel, watching her expression change from shock to anger as she read. "He wants to come back. After 30 years, he wants money," Carmen said bluntly. "And Mom thinks he might have figured out that our family is more financially successful than he expected when he left." Sophia set the letters down and stared at me. "How long have you known he was trying to contact you?" 2 years. 2 years. And you didn't tell?" "I didn't want him to become your problem. I didn't want you to have to choose between protecting me and having a relationship with your father." "Mom," Sophia said, her voice rising, "don't you think that should have been our choice to make?" It was the same argument Carmen had made about the secret financial help, and I realized that my children were right. In my desire to protect them from difficult decisions, I'd been making those decisions for them. "You're right," I said. "All of you are right. I should have been more honest about our financial situation, about your father's attempts to contact us, about the help I was providing behind the scenes." "Why weren't you?" Sophia asked. "Why all the secrecy?" I looked around my home office, at the evidence of a financial expertise my family had never acknowledged, at the letters from an ex-husband who'd abandoned us, and now wanted back in, at the faces of my children, who were struggling to reconcile the mother they thought they knew with the woman sitting in front of them. "Because I got tired of being dismissed and underestimated," I said finally. "Because every time I tried to talk about my investments, you treated them like hobbies. Because every time I made a financial decision, you questioned my competence. Because it became easier to handle things quietly than to keep fighting for respect I wasn't getting." The silence that followed was heavy with years of misunderstanding and missed communication. "Mom," Sophia said finally, "we're sorry, we had no idea." "I know you didn't, but going forward, I need things to be different. I need you to trust that I understand my own financial situation. I need you to respect my decisions about how to spend my money. And I need you to stop treating me like I'm incompetent, just because I'm retired." Carmen nodded. "And we need you to stop making major decisions about our lives without talking to us first." "Fair enough." Sophia looked around the room again, taking in all the evidence of my hidden expertise. "So what happens now?" "Now we figure out how to be a family that actually communicates honestly about money," I said. "And we decide together how to handle your father if he keeps trying to re-establish contact. And you're going to keep buying expensive cars and living like a rich person?" Sophia asked, with what might have been the beginning of a smile. "I'm going to keep living like someone who worked hard for 40 years and saved wisely for retirement," I corrected. "If that includes some nice cars and luxury travel, then yes." "Can I see the Mercedes?" Sophia asked suddenly. I laughed, the first genuinely relaxed laugh I'd had in months. "Of course you can see the Mercedes. We all went outside, and I gave my daughters a tour of my new car. They admired the leather seats, the advanced technology, the smooth, quiet engine, and for the first time in years, they looked at something I'd bought and saw evidence of good judgment, rather than questionable decision-making. "It's beautiful, Mom," Carmen said, running her hand along the polished exterior. "You deserve to drive something this nice." "I think so too," I said, as we stood in my driveway, admiring my Mercedes in the afternoon sunlight. I realized that something fundamental had shifted in our family dynamic. My children were beginning to see me as someone with knowledge and capabilities they'd never recognized before, and I was beginning to understand that protecting them from reality hadn't prepared them for the complexity of adult life. We still had a lot to work through. There were decades of assumptions to unravel, financial decisions to discuss openly, and the potential threat of Miguel's renewed interest in our family to address. But for the first time in years, I felt like we were having honest conversations instead of managing each other's expectations. The crisis of my retirement, the family's assumption that I'd become useless and financially vulnerable, had forced us all to confront truths we'd been avoiding for decades. And while the process was painful, the result was already promising to be worth. Standing there with my daughters, I realized that my portfolio might have made them temporarily useless in terms of their ability to help me financially, but it had also made our relationship stronger by forcing us to base them on honesty instead of assumption. Sometimes the most valuable investments aren't the ones that grow your wealth, but the ones that grow your family's understanding of who you really are. The phone call came at 6:23 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after my family had discovered the truth about my financial situation. I was in my kitchen, reviewing overnight market activity from Asian exchanges while my coffee brewed, when the landline rang with an urgency that made my chest tighten. "Mrs. Martinez?" The voice was unfamiliar, professional, with the careful neutrality of someone delivering bad news. "This is Detective Patricia Hernandez with the Sacramento Police Department. I'm calling regarding some inquiries we've received about your family." I set down my tablet and gave the call my full attention. "What kind of inquiry?" "Someone has been making requests for information about your children's employment records, your property ownership, and your financial account." These requests came through what appeared to be official channels, but when we investigated, we discovered they originated from a private investigator, working for someone who claims to be your former husband. The coffee maker finished brewing with a cheerful beep that seemed obscenely loud in the sudden silence of my kitchen. "Miguel." I'd been expecting something like this, but the reality still hit me like cold water. "What kind of information were they seeking?" "Employment verification for Roberto Martinez at Precision Auto Repair, salary information for Carmen Martinez Chen at Pharmatech Solutions, academic records for Sofia Martinez at UC Davis, and most concerning, asset verification for property owned by Hilda Martinez." My hands were steady as I poured my coffee, but my mind was racing. Miguel wasn't just trying to reconnect with his children, he was conducting reconnaissance, gathering intelligence about our family's financial situation with the thoroughness of someone planning a military camp. "Detective Hernandez, what exactly prompted you to investigate these requests?" The private investigator made a mistake. He submitted requests using forged letterhead from a law firm that doesn't exist. When the employment offices tried to verify the firm's credentials, they contacted us. We traced the requests back to a PI named Marcus Webb, who's been hired by someone claiming to be conducting due diligence for a family reconciliation. I almost laughed at the irony. Due diligence. Miguel was researching our family like a potential investment opportunity. "Detective, I need to tell you something important. The man who hired this investigator abandoned our family 32 years ago. He's provided no financial support in decades, and his sudden interest in reconnecting coincides suspiciously with certain changes in our family's financial circumstances. Mrs. Martinez, I think we need to meet in person. There's more to this situation than I can discuss over the phone." We arranged to meet that afternoon at the police station downtown. I spent the morning gathering documentation, divorce papers, child support records, Miguel's recent letters, and a timeline I created, showing the correlation between his renewed contact attempts and various indicators that our family had achieved financial success. The police station was a modern building with too much glass and not enough character, filled with the kind of fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly ill. Detective Hernandez was a woman in her 40s with intelligent eyes and the bearing of someone who'd seen enough human nature to be surprised by very little. "Mrs. Martinez," she said, settling across from me, in a small conference room with a recording device between us. "Tell me about your relationship with Miguel Martinez." I gave her the condensed version: high school sweethearts, married young, 3 children, his increasing irresponsibility with money, his affair with a coworker, the messy divorce when Sophia was 4, and his subsequent disappearance from our lives. Did he provide child support? Sporadically and minimally. He paid about 60% of what the court ordered, and only for the first 3 years after the divorce. When he remarried and moved to Nevada, the payments stopped entirely. Detective Hernandez made notes as I spoke. "And when did he first attempt to re-establish contact?" 2 years ago. Letters at first, then emails, then phone messages, always talking about how he'd changed, how he wanted to make amends, how he hoped to rebuild relationships with his children. Did you respond to any of these attempts? No, I didn't trust his motives, and I didn't want to give him any information about our family that he could use against us. Smart instinct, she said. "Martinez, the private investigator your ex-husband hired, has been conducting surveillance that goes well beyond public records research. He's been watching your house, photographing your new car, following your children to their workplaces." The casual way she delivered this information made it even more chilling. Miguel wasn't just curious about our lives, he was actively monitoring us. "How long has this been going on?" "Based on the investigator's activity logs, at least 6 months, but Mrs. Martinez, there's something else. The PI wasn't just gathering information about your family, he was also researching your investment accounts." My blood went cold. "How is that possible?" "He attempted to obtain information from your brokerage firm by impersonating a tax attorney conducting an estate planning review. The firm's security protocols prevented him from accessing your actual account details, but the attempt itself suggests your ex-husband has somehow learned about the existence of substantial assets." I thought about the time. 6 months ago was when I'd started restructuring my portfolio for greater liquidity, when I'd begun meeting more frequently with Gregory, when I'd first started seriously considering major purchases. Had Miguel somehow detected these changes in my financial activity? "Detective, how could he have known to look for investment accounts at all?" "As far as he knew when he left, I was a struggling single mother working as a secretary. That's what we need to figure out." "Has anyone in your family mentioned your financial situation to people outside your immediate circle?" "Social media posts, casual conversations, anything that might have reached your ex-husband's attention." I thought about it carefully. My children had only learned about my portfolio 3 weeks ago, and they'd been as shocked as Miguel would be. But there had been other indicators over the years, subtle signs that someone who knew what to look for might have noted. "Detective, my daughter Carmen was promoted to senior management last year. The announcement was in industry publications and on her company's website. My son Roberto was featured in a local newspaper article about successful small business partnership. My youngest daughter Sophia received academic honors that were announced online, all things that might suggest your family was doing well financially, and all things that someone monitoring us could have discovered through internet searches." Detective Hernandez leaned back in her chair. "Mrs. Martinez, we've been investigating Marcus Webb's other cases, and there's a pattern. He specializes in what we call financial reconnaissance, for clients going through divorces, inheritance disputes, or family reconciliation. His job is to determine whether pursuing legal action or rekindling relationships might be financially profitable for his clients." The picture was becoming clearer and more disturbing. Miguel hadn't experienced some spiritual awakening that made him want to reconnect with the children he'd abandoned. He'd identified our family as a potential source of financial gain, and hired a professional to determine how much money might be available. "What legal options do I have?" "Several. We can pursue charges against the PI for identity theft and attempted fraud. We can obtain a restraining order against your ex-husband prohibiting him from contacting you or your children, and we can work with your financial institutions to implement additional security measures. But we can't stop him from trying." "No, we can't. And Mrs. Martinez, based on what we've learned about his current situation, he's likely to escalate his efforts." She handed me a folder containing information that made my stomach drop. Miguel was living in Las Vegas, unemployed, recently divorced from his second wife, facing foreclosure on a house he couldn't afford, and dealing with significant gambling debts. He wasn't just interested in reconnecting with his children, he was desperate for money. How desperate? I asked. Desperate enough to hire an expensive private investigator despite being unable to pay his mortgage. Desperate enough to research financial fraud techniques. Desperate enough to consider legal action based on questionable claims about parental rights and community property. I studied the documents Detective Hernandez had provided. Miguel's financial situation was a textbook case of midlife crisis gone wrong. The stable job he'd left us for had ended years ago. The younger woman he'd married had divorced him and taken half of whatever assets he'd managed to accumulate. His attempts to maintain a lifestyle he couldn't afford had driven him into debt and bankruptcy. Detective, what's his most likely next move? Based on similar cases, he'll probably attempt direct contact with your children. He'll present himself as a reformed man seeking forgiveness, while gradually working the conversation toward family financial planning, inheritance discussions, or requests for loans to help him get back on his feet. And if that doesn't work, then he might pursue legal action. Frivolous lawsuits claiming he's entitled to a portion of assets accumulated during the marriage, or that he's owed compensation for missed opportunities to participate in his children's financial success. I felt a surge of anger that surprised me with its intensity. For 32 years I'd protected our family from Miguel's irresponsibility and selfishness. I'd worked 2 jobs, managed every household expense, invested carefully and built security that he'd contributed nothing toward. Now he wanted to return as if he'd never left, as if the success I'd achieved through decades of sacrifice was somehow partially his. Detective, I have over $1 million in investment assets that I accumulated entirely after my divorce. Legally, he has no claim to any of it. Correct? Correct. California law is clear that assets acquired after divorce remain separate property, but that doesn't prevent him from filing nuisance lawsuits or attempting to manipulate your children into providing financial support voluntarily. We spent another hour discussing security measures and legal protections. Detective Hernandez recommended that I alert my children about Miguel's investigation, install security cameras around my property, and work with my financial advisor to implement additional account protection. When I left the police station that afternoon, I felt like I was stepping into a different world. My quiet retirement, my comfortable routines, my newfound freedom to enjoy the wealth I'd built, all of it was now shadowed by the threat of a man who'd given up any claim to our family's success when he walked away 3 decades ago. That evening I called an emergency family meeting. Roberto, Carmen and Sofia gathered in my living room with expressions ranging from curious to concerned. I'd told them only that we needed to discuss something important about their father. Your father has hired a private investigator to research our family's financial situation, I said without preamble. The police are involved because the investigation included attempts to fraudulently access employment records and financial accounts. The silence that followed was complete. Roberto was the first to speak. What? I handed them copies of the police report and the documentation Detective Hernandez had provided. He's been watching us for at least 6 months. He knows about the Mercedes, about your promotions and achievements, and he's been trying to determine how much money our family has. Carmen read through the papers with her lawyer's attention to detail. Mom, this says he attempted to access your brokerage account by impersonating a tax attorney. He did. Fortunately, the firm's security protocols prevented him from getting any real information, but the attempt shows he somehow knows I have substantial investments. Sofia looked pale. He's been watching our houses, following us to work. According to the police report, yes. Roberto's face was flushed with anger. That son of a bitch abandoned us 30 years ago, and now he thinks he can just waltz back into our lives because he heard we're doing well. Roberto, language, Carmen said automatically, but her heart wasn't in the correction. She was too focused on the legal implications. Mom, what are his chances of successfully claiming any legal right to your assets? Legally, none. Everything I built was accumulated after our divorce, and California law is clear about separate property rights, but that doesn't mean he won't try to file frivolous lawsuits or manipulate you children into helping him voluntarily. What does he want? Sofia asked. I pulled out another folder, this one containing financial information about Miguel's current situation. He's broke, unemployed, facing foreclosure, and dealing with gambling debts. He's not seeking reconciliation out of love or regret. He's seeking reconciliation because he needs money. Carmen studied Miguel's financial profile with professional interest. These numbers are bad. Really bad. He's looking at personal bankruptcy within months if he doesn't find a significant source of income. Which explains why he suddenly remembered he had children after 3 decades of silence, Roberto said bitterly. Sofia was quiet for a long moment, processing the information. So what do we do? Several things, I said. First, we implement security measures. I'm having cameras installed around the house, and I want all of you to be aware that you might be under surveillance. Second, we establish clear communication protocols. If he contacts any of you directly, you need to tell me immediately. Don't engage with him, don't provide any information about our family, and don't agree to meet with him. And third, Carmen asked. Third, we prepare for the possibility that he might escalate to legal action or public pressure. We need to document everything, maintain detailed records, and be ready to defend ourselves if necessary. Roberto leaned forward in his chair. Mom, can I ask you something? Of course. Are you scared? I thought about it honestly. I'm angry. I'm protective of our family and the security I've built for us, but scared? No, he gave up any claim to our lives when he chose to leave them. I'm not going to let him intimidate me into giving him access to assets he contributed nothing toward building. Carmen nodded approvingly. Good, because Mom, you need to know that we're with you on this. Whatever he tries, whatever legal games he plays, we're not interested in having a relationship with someone who abandoned us and now wants to benefit from our success. Sofia agreed. I was 4 when he left. I don't remember him as a father, and I'm not going to start thinking of him as family just because he's decided we might be useful to him financially. Roberto's response was more colorful but equally supportive. The unity I felt from my children in that moment was worth more than any investment return I'd ever achieved. Over the next 2 weeks, we implemented our security measures. I had a professional security system installed with cameras covering all approaches to my house. My children changed their daily routines slightly, varying their routes to work and being more aware of their surroundings. We established a group text chain for immediate communication about any contact attempts. The cameras proved their worth within a week. On a Thursday afternoon, while I was at Gregory's office reviewing portfolio adjustments, my security system sent an alert to my phone. I opened the app and watched a man I barely recognized walk up to my front door and ring the bell. Miguel looked older than I'd expected, thinner, with gray hair and the slightly desperate appearance of someone who'd been under financial stress for too long. He was wearing what looked like his best clothes, but they hung on him awkwardly, as if he'd lost weight recently. When no one answered the door, he walked around the house, peering into windows and checking doors. He spent several minutes examining the Mercedes in my driveway, taking photos with his phone. Then he tried the back door before finally leaving. I called Detective Hernandez immediately. He just attempted to enter my property without permission. We'll add it to his file, Mrs. Martinez. The fact that he came to your house himself instead of sending the PI suggests he's running out of money to pay for professional surveillance. What's his next move likely to be? Direct contact with your children. He'll probably approach them at work or at home, presenting himself as a reformed father who's learned about their success and wants to be part of their lives. She was right. The next attempt came 2 days later, when Miguel showed up at Roberto's auto repair shop during the lunch hour. Roberto called me immediately. Mom, he's here. He's outside talking to my boss, asking about me. Did he see you? No, I'm in the back bay working on an engine. But Mom, he looks desperate, like really desperate. Roberto, go out the back entrance and drive straight to the police station. Call Detective Hernandez and tell her what's happening. Don't engage with him at all. What about my boss? Miguel's probably feeding him some story about being my long-lost father. I'll handle your boss. You just focus on getting somewhere safe. After Roberto left, I called his supervisor and explained the situation. The auto repair industry was small and close-knit, and news about deadbeat fathers trying to reconnect with successful children wasn't uncommon. Roberto's boss was more than willing to tell Miguel that Roberto wasn't available and wouldn't be available for the foreseeable future. Miguel's next attempt was more sophisticated. He sent flowers to Carmen's office, with a card that read,
To my beautiful daughter on her recent promotion, I've followed your success from afar, and couldn't be prouder. Your loving father, who dreams of the day we can talk again. Carmen called me from her office, her voice tight with controlled anger. Mom, how did he know about my promotion, and how did he get my work address? The promotion was announced in industry publications, and office addresses are public information. Carmen, whatever you do, don't respond to the flowers or the card, don't acknowledge them at all. I'm not planning to, but Mom, my coworkers are asking questions. They think it's sweet that my estranged father is trying to reconnect. This was exactly what I'd been afraid of. Miguel was weaponizing social pressure, using other people's expectations about family reconciliation to create pressure on my children to respond to his overtures. Carmen, you don't owe anyone an explanation about your family relationship. If people ask, just say it's complicated, and change the subject. What if he shows up here in person? Then you call security and have him removed. Your workplace has policies about unwanted visitors, and you have every right to enforce them. The escalation continued over the following week. Miguel sent Sofia a gift package at her apartment containing a photo album of her early childhood, along with a letter describing his regret about missing her growing up, and his hope that they could build a relationship now that she was an accomplished adult. He left voicemails on all of their phones, gradually shifting from general expressions of love and regret to more specific mentions of wanting to help them with their financial planning, to finally direct requests for small amounts of money to help him through a difficult time. The transformation in the tone of his messages was revealing. The loving father persona was wearing thin, replaced by increasingly desperate appeals that focused on what he perceived as our family's wealth and his own needs. Kids, said one voicemail I heard when Sophia played it for me, I know you've all done well for yourselves, and I'm so proud. I'm going through a rough patch right now, and I was hoping we could help each other out. You know, families should stick together, especially when some family members are struggling, while others are blessed with abundance. Families should stick together. Coming from a man who'd walked away from his family 32 years ago and provided no support since. The final straw came when Miguel appeared at Sofia's graduate program, claiming to be a proud father attending his daughter's academic presentation. Sofia didn't see him until after her presentation, when a classmate mentioned that her father had been in the audience asking questions about her research funding and future career prospects. Mom, Sofia said when she called me that evening, he's not just trying to reconnect, he's conducting research. He asked my classmate about my assistantship stipend, about whether I had student loans, about what kind of job prospects I have after graduation. Sofia, I think it's time we took more aggressive action. The next morning, I met with Detective Hernandez and a prosecutor named David Chen, who specialized in stalking and harassment cases. We reviewed all of Miguel's contact attempts, the private investigator's surveillance activities, and the escalating pattern of behavior that suggested he was becoming more desperate and less concerned about legal boundaries.
Mrs. Martinez, the prosecutor said, we have enough evidence to pursue multiple charges: stalking, harassment, attempted fraud, and conspiracy to commit identity theft. We can also obtain a comprehensive restraining order that would prohibit him from contacting you or your children directly or indirectly. What would that accomplish? It would give us legal grounds to roast him if he violates the order. More importantly, it would create a paper trail that would support more serious charges if his behavior escalates to threats or violence. Detective Hernandez added, Mrs. Martinez, men in Miguel's situation sometimes become increasingly erratic when their attempts at financial manipulation fail. The restraining order isn't just about preventing contact. It's about protecting your family if he decides to try more aggressive tactics. I thought about my children, about the security I'd spent decades building, about the peaceful retirement I'd worked so hard to achieve. Miguel had already stolen weeks of our peace of mind. I wasn't going to let him steal anything more. Let's file for the restraining order, I said, and let's pursue all available charges. I want him to understand that approaching my family was the biggest mistake he's made in a life full of bad decisions. The legal wheels began turning that afternoon. Within 48 hours, Miguel would be served with papers that would force him to choose between respecting our boundaries and facing serious legal consequences. But I had a feeling that a man desperate enough to hire a private investigator he couldn't afford, desperate enough to stalk his own children, desperate enough to attempt financial fraud, might not be deterred by legal paperwork alone. The real confrontation was still coming, and when it arrived, I intended to be ready for it. Miguel wanted to discover how much money his abandoned family had accumulated. He was about to find out that we had accumulated enough to hire the best lawyers, implement the most sophisticated security measures, and pursue legal action that would make his current financial problems look like minor inconvenience. He'd spent 32 years thinking he'd walked away from a struggling single mother and 3 children who would have no choice but to accept whatever crumbs of attention he might eventually offer. He was about to learn that he'd actually walked away from a family that had grown strong enough to protect itself from people exactly like him. The confrontation I'd been preparing for arrived on a Saturday morning in December, exactly 6 months after I'd bought the Mercedes that started this entire chain of events. I was in my kitchen wearing my favorite weekend clothes and enjoying my second cup of coffee while reviewing my investment portfolio's year-end performance, when the doorbell rang with an aggressive persistence that told me exactly who was standing on my porch. Through the security camera feed on my tablet, I watched Miguel pace back and forth in front of my door, his movements sharp and agitated. He looked worse than he had in the previous surveillance footage, thinner and more desperate, wearing clothes that had seen better days. When I didn't answer immediately, he began knocking loudly, then calling out in a voice that carried the particular edge of someone who'd reached the end of their options. "Hilda, I know you're in there. We need to talk. This has gone on long enough." I called Detective Hernandez first, then my children, alerting them that Miguel was attempting direct contact in violation of the restraining order that had been served 3 weeks earlier. Then I did something that would have surprised the woman I'd been a year ago. I opened the front. Miguel stopped mid-knock, his fist frozen in the air, clearly not expecting me to actually face him. Up close, the years had not been kind to him. His hair was gray and thinning, his face lined with the kind of stress that comes from poor decisions compounding over time. But his eyes still held the same self-centered charm that had once convinced a young woman to build a life with him. "Hello, Miguel," I said calmly, making no move to invite him inside. "You're violating a restraining order. Hilda, please, I just need 5 minutes. 5 minutes to explain." "Explain what?" "How you abandoned 3 children and now want access to their success. How you hired someone to spy on our family. How you've spent months trying to manipulate your way back into lives you gave up any claim to 32 years ago." Miguel's expression shifted through several emotions, settling on a mixture of desperation and anger that I remembered from our marriage. "I made mistakes. Hilda, I know that, but I'm still their father. I still have rights." "You have no rights," I said quietly. "You forfeited them when you stopped paying child support. You forfeited them when you disappeared from their lives completely. You forfeited them when you chose your new wife over your children. I was young. I was stupid. I was going through things you couldn't understand." "Miguel, I was young too. I was also going through things. The difference is that I didn't abandon my responsibilities." He stepped closer, and I was glad I'd left the door open, so the security cameras could record our conversation. "Hilda, I know you've done well for yourself. I know the kids are successful. I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for a chance to be part of the family I should never have left. You're asking for money. I'm asking for help from people who can afford to help. Family helps family." There it was. The core of his argument laid bare. Not genuine regret. Not authentic desire for relationship, but a simple transaction, access to our family's wealth in exchange for his presence in our lives. "Miguel, let me make something very clear to you," I said, my voice steady despite the anger building in my chest. "I spent 32 years raising the children you abandoned. I worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table while you sent sporadic child support payments that barely covered a week's groceries. I saved every spare dollar while you started a new life with someone else. I built a secure future for our family while you built nothing. But look what you accomplished," he said, gesturing toward the Mercedes in my driveway. "Look at this house. Look at how successful the kids turned out. You did great without me." "Exactly. We did great without you. We don't need you now. Miguel's face darkened. Hilda, I looked into your financial situation. I know about the investment accounts. I know how much money you have. You had someone attempt to fraudulently access my private financial information. I corrected. That's called a crime. I was trying to understand how my ex-wife went from being a struggling secretary to driving luxury cars and living like she's wealthy. Administrative assistant, I corrected automatically. And I went from struggling to financially secure by making smart decisions for 4 decades while you made poor ones. The sound of car doors slamming in my driveway interrupted our conversation. Roberto, Carmen, and Sofia had arrived together, and their expressions as they approached the porch suggested they were not in a mood for family reconciliation. Dad? Carmen said, her voice carrying all the authority of her corporate management position. You need to leave, now. Miguel turned to face his children, and I watched him try to shift into the loving father persona that had been wearing thin in his recent contact attempts. Carmen, sweetheart. You look wonderful. I saw the announcement about your promotion. I'm so proud of you. You don't get to be proud of me, Carmen replied flatly. You didn't contribute to any of the work that earned that promotion. Sofia stepped forward, her young face hard with determination. Dad? I don't remember you. I was 4 when you left. The only father figure I've ever had is Mom, who worked her ass off to give us everything we needed while you sent Christmas cards twice a decade. Roberto's response was more direct. Get off our mother's property before I call the police. Miguel's charm offensive crumbled in the face of his children's unified rejection. Kids, I understand you're angry. I understand I have a lot to make up for. But I'm your father. That has to count for something. It doesn't, Carmen said. Biology doesn't create obligations, behavior does. And your behavior for the past 32 years has been consistent absence. I'm here now, Miguel said, his voice rising with frustration. I'm trying to make things right. You're here now because you need money. Sofia shot back. You're not trying to make things right. You're trying to make things profitable. Miguel's mask slipped completely then, revealing the entitled anger I'd seen during our divorce proceedings. You know what? Fine, you want to play hardball. I consulted with lawyers. I have rights as their father. I have claims to marital assets that were accumulated during our marriage. No, you don't, I said calmly. I consulted with better lawyers. The confidence in my voice seemed to catch him off guard. What do you mean? I mean that every asset I own was accumulated after our divorce was finalized. I mean that my investment portfolio consists entirely of money I saved and invested from my post-divorce income. I mean that you have no legal claim to anything I've built, and any attorney who told you otherwise was either lying or incompetent. Carmen pulled out her phone and showed Miguel something on the screen. Dad, I ran a background check on you. Current residence, a rented room in Las Vegas. Current employment, unemployed for 8 months. Current debt load, 6 figures. Current legal status, facing foreclosure and bankruptcy. You're not here to reconnect with family. You're here because you're broke and desperate. Miguel stared at the information on Carmen's phone, his face cycling through emotions as he realized his children were not the naive targets he'd expected them to be. You investigated me. We protected ourselves, Roberto said. Same thing Mom's been doing for 30 years. Which brings me to my final point, I said, pulling a manila envelope from inside the house. Miguel, you're served. I handed him legal papers that had been prepared by the law firm Gregory had recommended, one of the most prestigious in the city. Miguel scanned the first page, his face growing pale. You're suing me? I'm pursuing criminal charges for stalking and harassment. I'm pursuing civil charges for invasion of privacy and intentional infliction of emotional distress. And I'm seeking financial damages to cover the security measures your behavior forced us to implement. Miguel looked up from the papers with genuine shock. Hilda, you can't be serious. I'm just trying to reconnect with my family. By hiring private investigators to spy on, by attempting to fraudulently access my financial accounts, by stalking your children at their workplaces. I shook my head. Miguel, you made a fundamental miscalculation. You assumed that because I was financially struggling when you left, I would still be vulnerable to your manipulation 30 years later. Carmen stepped closer to her father, her corporate negotiation skills fully engaged. Dad, here's what's going to happen. You're going to leave immediately and never contact any member of this family again. You're going to drop any fantasies about legal claims to Mom's assets, and you're going to disappear from our lives permanently. And if Sophia answered with the confidence of someone who'd grown up watching her mother handle difficult situations. Then Mom's going to use that $1 million portfolio to hire lawyers who will make your current financial problems look like pocket change. She's going to pursue every legal remedy available, and trust me, when you're dealing with someone who can afford the best legal representation money can buy, those remedies are extensive. Roberto added, and Dad, just so we're clear, even if you somehow convinced a judge to order Mom to give you money, which won't happen, we 3 kids would never speak to you again, so you'd end up with nothing anyway. Except you'd also be dealing with criminal charges and civil judgment. Miguel stood there holding the legal papers, surrounded by the family he'd thought he could manipulate, finally understanding that he'd grossly misjudged the situation. The struggling single mother he'd abandoned had become a financially sophisticated woman with resources to protect herself. The dependent children he'd expected to find had become successful adults with no need for his approval or presence. This isn't how it was supposed to go, he said quietly. No, I agreed. You were supposed to disappear quietly 32 years ago and stay disappeared. But you got greedy, and now you're facing consequences you never imagined. Detective Hernandez's police car pulled into my driveway at that moment, arriving in response to my earlier call. Miguel saw the car and seemed to deflate completely, the last of his fight draining away. Miguel Martinez, Detective Hernandez called out as she approached the group on my porch. Yes, you're under arrest for violation of a restraining order. As Detective Hernandez handcuffed Miguel and read him his rights, he looked back at me with something that might have been genuine remorse, though it was hard to tell if he was sorry for his behavior or just sorry he'd been caught. Hilda, he said as the detective guided him toward the police car, I really did want to make things right. Miguel, I replied, if you'd wanted to make things right, you would have started 32 years ago by being a responsible father. It's too late now. After the police car drove away, my children and I stood in my driveway processing what had just happened. The confrontation we'd been building toward for months was over, decided not by emotional manipulation or legal maneuvering, but by the simple reality that Miguel had fundamentally misunderstood who we'd become in his absence. Mom, Sophia said finally, that was incredibly satisfying. Carmen nodded. I can't believe I used to wonder what it would be like if he came back into our lives. Now I know. It would have been exactly like that, except we would have been too young to protect ourselves. Roberto was more philosophical. You know what's crazy? He thought he could just show up and claim a piece of what you built, like he'd been contributing all along. That's exactly what he thought. I agreed. Miguel never understood that building wealth requires discipline, sacrifice, and long-term thinking. He assumed that if we had money, it must have come easily, which meant he deserved a share of it. We went inside and sat around my kitchen table, the same table where I'd spent countless hours teaching them about budgeting and responsibility while secretly building the portfolio that had just protected us all. Mom, Carmen said, I owe you an apology. For all those years of treating you like you didn't understand money, for assuming you needed our guidance about financial decisions, for not recognizing that you were probably the most financially sophisticated person in our family. Sophia agreed. I feel like such an idiot for trying to manage your retirement like you were helpless. Roberto laughed, but it was a rueful sound. Ma, we spent years worrying about you being taken advantage of by financial scammers, and it turns out, you were sophisticated enough to protect all of us from an actual scammer. You weren't idiots, I said. You were loving children who wanted to protect your mother. There's nothing wrong with that instinct. But we should have asked more questions, Carmen insisted. We should have tried to understand what you were actually doing instead of assuming we knew. You should have. I agree. But I also should have been more open about my financial situation instead of letting you make assumptions that weren't true. Sophia leaned back in her chair. So what happens now, with Dad? I mean, now he faces the legal consequences of his choices. The criminal charges will probably result in fines and probation,
The civil lawsuit will establish a permanent legal record that will make it very difficult for him to attempt this kind of manipulation again. And financially, financially, his situation will get worse before it gets better. Legal fees, court costs, and potential damages will add to his existing debt load. He'll probably end up in bankruptcy, which might actually be the best thing for him long term. Carmen looked thoughtful. Mom, do you feel bad about pursuing legal action against him? I considered the question carefully. I feel bad that it was necessary. I feel bad that a man I once loved became someone capable of trying to exploit his own children. But I don't feel bad about protecting our family from someone who meant us harm, even though he's our father. Sophia asked. Being a father is about more than biology, I said. It's about presence, support, sacrifice, and love. Miguel may be your biological father, but he stopped being your dad 32 years ago. We spent the rest of the afternoon talking about family, money, and the importance of honest communication. My children asked detailed questions about my investment strategy, my financial planning, and my long-term goals. For the first time in years, I felt like they were seeing me as a complete person rather than just their mother. Mom, Roberto said as they were preparing to leave, what are you going to do now? I mean, now that this whole situation with Dad is resolved and we all understand your real financial situation, I'm going to take that Mediterranean cruise I've been researching. I'm going to renovate this kitchen the way I've always wanted to. I'm going to buy nice clothes and eat at good restaurants, and enjoy the fruits of 40 years of hard work. And investment-wise, Carmen asked, I'm going to continue building wealth, but I'm also going to start enjoying it more. I spent so many years focused on accumulation that I forgot about the importance of actually using money to improve your life. Sophia grinned. Does that mean you're going to buy more expensive cars? It means I'm going to buy whatever cars I want when I want them, because I can afford them and because life is too short to drive uncomfortable vehicles just to meet other people's expectations about how retirees should live. As my children left that evening, each of them hugged me with what felt like genuine respect for the first time in years. They weren't humoring their aging mother or managing my expectations. They were embracing a woman they'd finally recognized as competent, successful, and worthy of admiration. Over the following weeks, Miguel's legal situation played out exactly as I'd expected. He pleaded guilty to violating the restraining order, paid substantial fines, and was sentenced to community service and probation. The civil lawsuit resulted in a judgment that would follow him for years, ensuring that any future financial recovery would be partially devoted to compensating our family for the security measures his behavior had necessitated. More importantly, the legal proceedings created a permanent record that would make it extremely difficult for Miguel to attempt similar schemes in the future. Any future romantic partners, business associates, or family members would be able to discover his history of stalking and financial manipulation with a simple background check. The ordeal had one unexpected positive outcome. It forced my family to have honest conversations about money, expectations, and respect that we should have had years earlier. Carmen, Roberto, and Sophia began consulting me about their own financial decisions, recognizing that I had knowledge and experience that could benefit them. Carmen asked for advice about her company's stock option plan. Roberto sought guidance about expanding his auto repair business. Sophia wanted help understanding graduate school financing and career planning. For the first time in decades, they were treating me as someone with valuable expertise rather than someone who needed protection from her own poor judgment. 3 months after Miguel's arrest, I booked the Mediterranean cruise I'd been researching for years. 14 days, a suite with a private balcony, shore excursions to places I'd dreamed about since I was young. The cost was significant, but it represented less than 6 months of dividend income from my portfolio. I also began the kitchen renovation I'd been planning, updating appliances, countertops, and cabinets to create the kind of cooking space I'd always wanted but never felt justified in purchasing. I hired a landscaping company to redesign my backyard, adding a deck and garden areas that would give me outdoor space worthy of my new lifestyle. The most significant change, though, was in how I thought about myself and my accomplishments. For years I'd downplayed my financial success, treating it as something to be hidden rather than celebrated. Miguel's attempted manipulation, had forced me to acknowledge not just what I'd built, but why it was worth protecting. I'd created financial security not through luck or inheritance, but through decades of discipline, research, and smart decision-making. I'd raised 3 successful children as a single mother while building wealth that most families never achieve. I'd navigated market crashes, economic recessions, and personal challenges, while consistently growing my net worth year after year. These weren't accomplishments to be embarrassed about or hidden from view. They were achievements to be proud of, evidence of intelligence and perseverance that deserved recognition and respect. The day I left for my Mediterranean cruise, my children gathered at my house to see me off. I was wearing new clothes, carrying new luggage, and driving my Mercedes to the airport where I would board a flight to Barcelona. Everything about the trip represented the kind of lifestyle I could have been living for years if I hadn't been so concerned about other people's expectations. "Mom," Carmen said as she hugged me goodbye, "you look like a completely different person." "I feel like a completely different person," I admitted, "or maybe I feel like the person I always was, but was afraid to show." Roberto handed me a card signed by all 3 children. Inside they'd written, "To the strongest, smartest, most successful woman we know. Thank you for showing us that real strength isn't about pretending to be weak." Sophia added, "And thank you for showing us that Dad made the biggest mistake of his life when he walked away from our family." As I drove to the airport in my beautiful car, wearing my expensive clothes, carrying luggage for a luxury vacation I could easily afford, I reflected on the past year's events. My family had called me useless after retirement, assuming I'd become a burden who needed their protection and guidance. Instead, my retirement portfolio had made them useless in terms of their ability to help me financially, while simultaneously demonstrating that their mother was more financially sophisticated than any of them had imagined. But the real victory wasn't financial. The real victory was that my family finally saw me as I actually was, a competent, successful woman who'd built something extraordinary through her own efforts and deserved to enjoy the results. Miguel had tried to return to our lives because he thought we'd become wealthy and vulnerable. Instead, he'd discovered that we'd become wealthy and strong with resources and knowledge sufficient to protect ourselves from people exactly like him. My children had thought retirement would make me dependent on them. Instead, it had revealed that I'd been quietly building independence for decades, creating security that could benefit all of us while ensuring that no one could ever again threaten the family I'd worked so hard to protect. The woman boarding that flight to Barcelona wasn't the same woman who'd retired from the school district a year earlier. She was the same woman who'd always existed beneath the surface, finally free to live openly as the successful person she'd always been. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.